Hello, I'm Randy. I'm 17 now, but the story that I want to share with you happened a few years ago when I was only 13. This was the hardest and the most awful period of my life. I should probably start this talking about the death of my closest friend ever. Michael was 14 and he'd been suffering from a severe disability since he was born. He had a very weak immune system and it was so bad that he couldn't even go to school. As a matter of fact, I was the only person his age that he could speak to. Not only were we friends, but our parents also had a really close relationship since we lived next door to each other. Some of our neighbors even assumed that we were all one family. We spent each and every holiday together, and oftentimes I stayed the night at Michael's house. So, we were brothers, and even though I knew some other guys from school, he was the closest friend I'd ever had in my life. Even though everybody knew that Michael was going to die as a kid, it was really hard to swallow when he actually passed. I remember right after the funeral, while his and my parents were busy with their adult stuff, I snuck to Michael's room. Everything there was exactly the same way it was when he was still alive. Michael used to sit on the windowsill and look out at our street, waiting for me to visit him after school. So I just sat there and tried to remember every single detail of our friendship. I hadn't even realized that I'd fallen asleep, but I do remember that I had a dream about Michael, and he was there next to me in his room, and he said he was happy because he no longer felt any pain. And it took me a second to realize that it was the next morning when I woke up in his former bedroom. Later on, I found out that Michael's dad had found me, but he didn't want to wake me up. I don't know why people say that the pain of loss gets better with time, because it doesn't. About a month later, Michael's parents decided to sell their house and move away. But you know what was strange? They seemed to no longer be friends with my parents. I mean, I knew they were going through a lot of grief, but I'd always thought that it would be better to have someone close nearby in that case. We no longer spent evenings all together in the backyard like we used to, and our dads never fought over another football game or things like that. I tried to ask my mom what was going on, but she would only say that I was too young to understand. I remember once when my dad was at work and my mom was doing something with her daisies in the garden. Michael's mom had come over. Apparently there was no one except me in the kitchen, so she just came up and sat down nearby and started asking some regular questions about school and stuff. For a second, I felt as if nothing had ever changed between our two families. But then my mom saw us talking. She'd gotten really nervous and told her former best friend to leave us alone in a very rude way. Then she told me to go to my room and never talk to Michael's parents again. I was totally confused, but I decided not to argue with her. To be honest, I'd never seen my mom that furious before. A few days later, it was already late and I had practically fallen asleep when I'd heard some voices downstairs. It seemed like my parents were arguing about something in a loud whisper, so to speak. I'd gotten curious and I went to find out what was going on. I saw my parents and Michael's, and everyone seemed to be worried and angry. I stayed hidden over the stairs to try to hear what all the fighting was about. Suddenly, my dad looked up the stairs and noticed me. I guess all four grown-ups had finally come to the conclusion that I finally had to know everything, because Michael's parents almost immediately disappeared, and so my parents invited me to the kitchen. What happened afterward changed my view of everything and everyone that I thought I had known. My parents told me that many years ago, Michael's mom had given birth to another boy. She and her husband had already had a son who was sick, and they'd been trying for almost a year to cope with two children. But then their financial troubles began. They didn't know what they were going to do, and that's when my parents bought a house next to theirs. Our two families had become friends, and Michael's parents had found out that their new neighbors couldn't have their own babies due to some medical issues. That's how the idea was born to have them adopt their second child. Anyway, their plan had been implemented, and the two couples were happy having not only a shared fence, but a common son. But when Michael died and his parents decided to move away, they wanted their second son to stay close to him, and this meant that he had to know the truth. But his legal parents were not ready for that. At first, I didn't get that whole story was about me, and I thought that I was still sleeping. It couldn't be true that my mom and dad were actually not my mom and dad, and that our neighbors were my real parents. I mean, yeah, we'd always been close, our two families, and Michael and I had been like brothers. Wait a minute. We actually were brothers, as it now turned out, and I just lost my only blood sibling. I felt like I was totally lost. Of course, mom and dad, the ones I'd been living with, tried to calm me down and find the right words to explain everything, but I couldn't stop crying. The only thing I wanted back then was for Michael to be alive so we could run away together from these grown-up liars. Time has passed and my life has sort of gotten back to normal. Michael's parents, I'll keep calling them that so you don't get confused, finally sold their house and moved somewhere else. And the family that bought it also had a son who was my age, and we've become friends. And I finally felt relief, because I guess there's nothing harder in the world than living in uncertainty. I've had plenty of talks about everything with my mom and dad since then, and they even took me to a child psychologist for a couple of months. To be frank, if I were them, I'd probably done the same thing, and I would have tried to keep this kind of secret for as long as I could. We haven't been in touch with Michael's parents for years, but 2 weeks ago I received a letter from Australia. It was from them, and it was the longest letter I've ever seen in my life. All in all, it included their apologies to me for everything. And it was about their life in Sydney, and about their depression of falling apart with my mom and dad. And they also kindly asked the three of us to come and visit them there. They even promised to buy us tickets as soon as we decide on the dates. So now I'm packing my stuff to go to Australia for a whole month. Who knows? Maybe my next story here will be about this trip. See you soon, and don't forget to click the like and share buttons.